It's a great pleasure to be talking to you from ordinarily sunny Johannesburg, but it's dark now because it's about just after 6 in the evening. And over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to frame what I see as 4 intersecting dilemmas that characterize the challenge confronting us over the next several decades. So just some prefacing remarks. I think although I don't know all of you, I know some of you, I think it's a fairly safe bet that most of us have spent more time thinking about the COVID pandemic in the last 12 months than we've spent thinking about climate change over the course of our entire lives. It may not be true of this particularly august group, but it's certainly true of most of the audiences that I address. And this is problematic because climate change is orders of magnitude more consequential in terms of lasting socio-ecological damage. But climate change is at once too slow to be treated as a crisis and yet too serious to be treated as anything else, anything other than a crisis. And I think there are some learnings that we can tease out of the pandemic that we can maybe bring to bear over the next 30 years or so. But before I start, I'm going to assert that we're first and foremost facing a crisis of leadership. And so I borrow some words from Jennifer Garvey-Berger, who's an expert in leadership coaching and development, and she issues 3 challenges to aspiring leaders. She challenges us to ask different questions, number 1, to take multiple perspectives, number 2, and to think in systems, number 3. So that's where I'm going to begin, thinking in systems. So it's endlessly engrossing to take in the world as a series of events, and constantly surprising because that way of seeing the world has no predictive or explanatory value. I don't know if any of you recognize who wrote these words, but I'll do the reveal now. Like the tip of an iceberg rising above the water, events are the most visible aspects of a larger complex, but are not usually the most important. And I think these are the words of the late Donella Meadows, who I think was perhaps the most accomplished communicator of systems thinking that's probably ever lived. And this is how she framed it. We tend to be captivated by events, and we experience them and react to them in isolation from the larger system from which they emerge. So like the tip of an iceberg rising above the water, I should issue a disclaimer at this point. Apparently icebergs look nothing like this in real life, but if you type iceberg into Google Images, you get something that looks like this. This is like the classic kind of ice cream cone view of an iceberg, but this iceberg in real life would very quickly tip onto its side. But anyway, it's just really a metaphor. So the events are the part of the iceberg that are poking above the surface of the water. Are at, around, or just beneath the surface, we can discern patterns and trends. We go deeper into the iceberg, we find systems and structures that set those patterns and trends in motion. And right at the bottom lie our paradigms or our worldviews, our mental models. And it's clearly the events, certainly the most visible part. Patterns and trends are to a certain extent visible, but rarely seen, let alone re-examined, are the systems and structures and paradigms. And so, as I mentioned, we react to events. We can, to a certain extent, anticipate patterns and trends. We ought to be thinking about how to redesign our systems and our structures. And we very, very rarely think about transforming our paradigms. As I mentioned, we're often not even aware that we live within paradigms and that we hold paradigms. These are the unspoken assumptions very often. And just to give you one example that I use often of a paradigm or a mental model, I use the example of geocentrism versus heliocentrism in terms of how we think about the structure of the solar system. Now, both geocentrism and heliocentrism are both intersubjective beliefs about an objective physical reality, but only one of them accurately corresponds to that objective physical reality. And yet we survived as a species for many, many millennia with the inaccurate one. And so the fact that a given paradigm seems to have worked in the past doesn't mean that it's the best one to pursue indefinitely. And I submit that we need to start re-examining our paradigms. And one of the reasons is because we get increasing leverage. If we want to bring about change, leverage increases the deeper we go within this iceberg model. It also becomes harder to affect change there. But if you can bring about change there, then at the deeper levels, then you can affect some quite profound change. Now, why do we need to? Well, because the complexity of our problems is growing beyond our capacity to respond. So the task demands of civilization exceed the capacity of that civilization to respond, then you have an existential problem. And we seem trapped in reactive mode. And I think, again, this is something that became clear, certainly to me through the pandemic, is that we love an event to react to. And I worry that if we commit ourselves to that mode of behavior, then we will bring down all of the benefits of advanced civilization. And something will probably rise from the ashes, but it won't be anything that we recognize today. So the four intersecting dilemmas that I want to talk about are, firstly, a little bit more about paradigms, and then practicalities, physics, and politics. So let's start with paradigms. So the painting on your screen is of Princes Street in Edinburgh, around about the turn of the, going from the 18th century into the 19th century, around about that time. And the reason I share this image is because on Princes Street in Edinburgh today, you'll find the statue of a very famous economist who wrote some very famous words around about the time that this painting was painted. And some of you, I'm sure, will recognize these words. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. And I contend that this is a dominant paradigm today. This persists today. This is a worldview that, in my sort of 15 years or so as a practicing sustainabologist, I've had these words thrown at me with almost the gravity of biblical verse, right? That this is almost chiseled into tablets of stone, and we, back off, because this is how the world is. And so I went back to see, well, what did the world look like when these words were chiseled in those tablets of stone? So in 1776, when the Wealth of Nations was published, in case anyone remains in any doubt, it's Adam Smith, if I didn't mention that already. And when the Wealth of Nations was published, and these words were published in 1776, the human population of the world was 800 million. That's 1/10 of what it is today. And this was 5 years before James Watt's steam engine. So to all intents and purposes, these words were written on the face of a completely different planet than the one that we inhabit today. And yet they still have extraordinary currency and a grip on popular imagination, certainly in the circles that I move in the corporate sphere. So I imagined, just as a thought experiment, imagine we could reanimate the corpse of Adam Smith and let him loose in the 21st century, and play around with this passage. So it's not from the benevolence of the mining companies that we expect our freshwater pollution, but from their regard to their own self-interest. Or it's not from the benevolence of the car manufacturers that we expect our respiratory diseases, but from their regard to their own self-interest. Or it's not from the benevolence of the banker that we expect our foreign exchange manipulation, but from their regard to their own self-interest. So the popular conception of this worldview appeared in a New York Times article in 1970, when Milton Friedman wrote, we often hear him quoted as saying, the business of business is business. And he didn't quite say that. He wrote an article called The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits. And in it, he said the businessmen, and in those days it was men, who declaim that business is not concerned merely with profit, but also with promoting desirable social ends and has a social conscience, are preaching pure and unadulterated socialism. Now, this was written in 1970. This is the height of the Cold War. So you can imagine this was literally hammering a stake through the heart of any nascent stakeholder capitalism movement. And so this, I suggest, is sort of the popular the popular conception of it's not from the benevolence of the butcher and the baker and the brewer. But then Friedman went on to write later on in the same article, and this is often overlooked, I think, that an executive's responsibility is to conduct the business in accordance with its owner's desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible, while conforming to the basic rules of society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. Now, those last two words, ethical custom, suggest that even for Milton Friedman or any of his acolytes, what society expects of business in terms of ethics and values is something that business has to conform to. So even within the business of business's business, ethical custom matters. This explicit acknowledgement, rather, raises the bar considerably higher than anything legal and profitable is fine. And so we start to see some interesting things emerge from this. And there was a recent example, if anyone's in any doubt, of this ethical custom. In the UK last month, 6 defendants stood trial accused of causing criminal damage to the oil company Shell's headquarters in London. These defendants represented themselves before a jury of 12 men and women selected at random from the UK population. And in directing the jury to consider its verdict, the judge advised that the accused had no defense in law. And then the jury found all the defendants not guilty. And that, I think, is a remarkable demonstration of this principle that corporations have to conform to the basic rules of society, not only those embodied in law, because the law is frequently a lagging indicator of societal expectations. And I think that this example from just a month ago is Friedman's ethical custom caveat in practice. I don't know whether he imagined that something like this would actually come to pass, but it's an interesting, perhaps, crack in the doorway of a new conception of business and business's responsibility, perhaps even a new business paradigm. Now, practicalities. Remember, we're talking about climate change in the midst of a pandemic. And I think if I'd suggested to you that we need to flatten the curve 18 months ago, you might have given me blank stares. What do you mean flatten the curve? But now if I say flatten the curve, we all know what that means, right? We're trying to, in the context of the pandemic, flattening the curve means slow down the progression of infections to not reduce the total number of infections necessarily, although it may do that too, but actually just to keep the peak of infections below the healthcare system capacity. So to reduce the burden on our healthcare infrastructure and therefore reduce the mortality rate. So in this chart, in this schematic, the peak on the left is obviously the gradient of the curve is much steeper and faster and ascends to a much higher level. There'll be many, many more fatalities than in the peak on the right. And of course, the dotted line isn't static either, because while we're delaying the infections, we can also build additional healthcare system capacity. So perhaps the dotted line should be going upwards to the right. But the point is here, the area under the curve in this schematic is the same, but the damage that we experience is very, very different. So what's this got to do with climate change? Well, here are historical emissions from 1850, when things really started to get going. The Industrial Revolution was well underway. And you'll see how emissions of CO2, at least, have risen quite sharply in the recent years. Now, if we wanted to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which is the lower bound of the Paris Agreement, for a 2/3 chance of limiting warming to 1.5, had we started in 2000, then the gradient of emissions reductions would have looked like this. And so it would have been approximately symmetrical. Even as recently as 2000, we would have had a descent of 1 to 2% a year globally. That would have been enough to give us a likely chance of stabilizing at 1.5 degrees. We didn't do that. As you can see, over the last 20 years, we didn't only increase emissions, we actually accelerated the increase in emissions. So now, for the same area under the curve, if we started in 2020 when emissions fell as a consequence of pandemic controls, you can see the gradient of the curve is extraordinarily steep now. So just kicking the can down the road for 20 years has made that green curve that was a 1 to 2% emissions reduction, that's now risen to about 8% for the next decade. 8% global emissions reductions every year for the next 10 years. Now, to put that into context, that's what we achieved in 2020 as a consequence of pandemic controls. So that felt like the Earth being tipped, or at least as far as human beings are concerned, the Earth being tipped off a cliff. And that gave us 1 year of the emissions reductions that we need to repeat if we're going to meet the lower bounds of the Paris Agreement. So how do we flatten the curve? Well, there's only one way to do it now. We have to renegotiate, if you like, our risk appetite and accept more climate change damages. And so if we go for the 2 degrees threshold in the Paris Agreement, you can see that that has the effect of flattening the curve. But of course, that's another way of saying we accept greater climate change damages in order to find a new gradient that we think we might be able to ride. Because remember, the gradient of the curve is really a representation of hardship and dislocation and discontinuity. We can't achieve these emissions reductions by disaster, because we know what that feels like now. We have to do it by design. Okay, so this is largely an energy story, as we know, not exclusively, but I'm going to talk mostly about energy here. So we've done energy transitions in the past, right? We know this. We moved from traditional biofuels to coal. And then you can see how coal grew its share of primary energy consumption from 7% in 1850 up to 55% 60 years later. And then oil starts to get underway at the turn of the 20th century. Then oil starts to displace coal. So now coal falls to 28%. And then you can see the same trend happening with natural gas. And if you're extremely optimistic, you can see maybe in the future something similar happening to these zero carbon sources of energy. By the way, at this point, I should say I'm not vouching for any of these zero carbon energy sources. I'm just presenting the composition of our current energy system in relative terms. So it seems that we've done energy transitions in the past. And if you speak to energy experts, you'll often hear that an energy transition takes 50 to 60 years. Now, remember from the previous slide, we've got about 30 years to do this. If we've got to get down to zero by 2050, then we've really got 30 years to execute this energy transformation. And we're told it takes 50 to 60 years. So we have to do it in half the time. It's much more serious than that, actually, because what I'm doing here, this is a slight trick of the light. I'm showing you primary energy consumption on a relative scale. If we now look on an absolute scale, the energy evolution looks like this. So while coal shrank its relative share from 55% to 28%, in other words, while coal halved its contribution to in relative terms, to the global primary energy consumption, it quadrupled in size over those 100 years. So if you look at every single one of these wedges, you'll notice that in actual fact, we have never in our history prosecuted an energy transition, let alone within 50 to 60 years, and we have to do it in 30 years. It's never happened before. Every time we discovered a new energy source, we stacked it on top of the existing ones, which themselves grew over our history. Now, we use the word, often you hear the word unprecedented gets bandied about, and almost to the point of it becomes completely stripped of meaning. This is truly unprecedented. We have no historical precedent for what we currently face, because those wedges, some combination of those wedges, I wonder if I can use actually my pen. I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screen. Some combination of these wedges have to grow to 100% of our energy system in 30 years, which is a line that looks something like this. Something like 30 years. So that's practicalities. What I mean when I say physics. I'm glad you asked that question. A little bit more systems theory from Donella Meadows. So a delay in a feedback loop, a feedback process, I beg your pardon, is critical relative to rates of change in the system state that the feedback loop is trying to control. Overlong delays in a system with a threshold, a danger point, a range past which irreversible damage can occur, cause overshoot and collapse. So let's have another look at the pandemic. This is a fast feedback loop. Doesn't feel like it, right? Because it looks like we're deeply into year 2 of this pandemic, and where I'm sitting in Africa, I think we maybe are, if we're lucky, we're halfway through, if we're lucky. But if you look at actually the feedback in the system, in other words, the information that we retrieve from the system in response to interventions that we make in the economy, you'll see it's actually quite fast. So this is Germany in the first wave. School closures on the 13th of March, borders closed 2 days later. A week after that, national curfew, gradual reopening of the economy after 52 days. And a couple of weeks after that, we had football. This is real football, by the way, guys. This isn't, I mean, you call this soccer. This is football, let me tell you. And Germany, thankfully, managed to get football back. So this was something approximating advanced human civilization returning within 2 months of the outbreak of infections in Germany. 2 months. So what does a slow feedback loop look like? Well, for that, we have to look at climate change. So now this slide deserves a little bit of explanation. We've got the historical record here, the black line, the black trend line showing historical temperature. This is now not emissions. This is the rising surface temperature over the last 120 years or so. I want you to focus on this scale on the right-hand side because this is approximately the pre-industrial level. So this is what Paris refers to. And then you'll see there are 2 forward scenarios for temperature stabilization, or rather temperature, global average temperature projections. So the first one is a stabilization at 1.5 degrees. So this blue line here is if we pull out all the stops and basically do nothing but decarbonize our economy for the next 30 years, with all that implies from the previous slides, then we have something that looks quite benign from a climate change perspective, or comparatively benign. Still climate damage in this scenario, but it looks like a gentle kind of soft landing and a stabilization at 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial level. If, on the other hand, this is at the other extreme. Now, I'm not suggesting this is necessarily likely, but this is what the computer models suggest, that if we just continue on a business as usual trajectory that assumes growth in consumption of coal, oil, and gas, and so on, then we end up here at around about 4.5 degrees by the end of the century. Now, what's this got to do with feedback loops? I'm going to ask you to focus on the next 30 years, because the next 30 years, this is the period that determines whether we're on the blue trajectory or the red trajectory. The next 30 years look like this, blown up. Now the plumes, those shaded areas either side of the solid lines, are the uncertainties in the climate models. And you'll notice that over the next 30 years, this exploded part of the chart, the overlap in these two scenarios is quite substantial. Now, that's another way of saying we may be on the red trajectory and think we're on the blue one, or vice versa. That the response that we get, the feedback that we get from the climate system over the next 30 years is going to be difficult to tell which one we're on. We get roughly, to a certain extent, we get, potentially the same amount of warming over the next 30 years, irrespective of what we do. That's the first point. The second point is, in both scenarios, climate change continues to worsen. That means while we are doing 30 years of extreme, it's often been talked like wartime footing to re-engineer our entire energy system, which is to say our entire economy, climate change continues to worsen. Now, this is really worth pausing and thinking about quite seriously, because I don't know if human beings have the psychological equipment to deal with these types of feedback loops with a 30-year delay. Notice that after 2050, these are radically different worlds. And if that sounds a long way off, it's really not. For a child born today, they're going to be 29 in 2050, right? So this is they're just starting out in their working life. Maybe they've finished tertiary education and they're a couple of years into their careers in 2050, and those futures are radically different. But for the next 30 years, we've got to get this program to hold politically. That has to hold, and we have to stay with it, knowing that all the while things continue to get worse. How? Psychologically, how do we deal with that? We were fed up with pandemic controls after a couple of weeks. So I mentioned politics there. I said, how do we politically deal with that? Now, when I talk about politics now, and you say I mentioned these things intersect, right? So I've kind of already bled into the fourth dilemma. I'm talking about politics really with a small p. What I mean by that is politics in the sense of who holds and exerts power over whom, rather than party politics. But of course, they're very, very strongly correlated. So psychologically, again, the pandemic was or is comparatively easy to deal with psychologically, because there is a clear enemy, in inverted commas. Our best understanding at the moment, although there are competing theories, but at the moment, our best understanding is wet market in Wuhan and somebody ate a bat, right? That's the seems to be the consensus view at the moment. So there's a clear outgroup, right? If it weren't for these people and their behaviors, then we wouldn't have to deal with this nonsense. And we know the previous president, previous incumbent of the White House, liked to talk about the Wuhan flu or the China virus and all that kind of stuff. So psychologically, much easier to deal with. Climate change, in contrast, is the enemy within. It's caused by virtually all profitable economic activity undertaken by people going about the course of their daily lives without, not people harboring any ill will, but people just going around performing activities within a construct, and often those activities are also the enjoyable ones, the ones that result in higher comfort levels, that are exciting, that are just part of an aspirational model of development. And so the problem here psychologically is that the cause of climate change is not those people over there and their crazy behaviors. It's, I'm looking at it right now. I'm staring at I'm looking in the mirror. Climate change issues from the enemy within. And linked into that are the vested interests that are involved in maintaining the current paradigm. So what do we do to kind of deal with the pandemic? Well, we sanitize our hands frequently. We may or may not wear face masks depending on our political leanings, and we stand 2 meters apart in public spaces. So that's how you deal with the pandemic. And maybe you also pray for a vaccine. How do you deal with climate change? Take the largest corporations on earth and turn them upside down. That's how you do it. So the vested interests in the incumbent power in the existing system, in maintaining it, in leading us astray, in presenting false solutions is enormous. Because addressing climate change, what it really entails is, and I'm quoting now John Elkington, who's actually my former boss in sustainability, addressing climate change entails the fundamental intergenerational task of winding down dysfunctional economic and business models of the 19th and 20th centuries and the evolutions of new ones fit for a human population headed towards 9 billion, living on a small planet already an ecological overshoot. So in one paragraph, in one sentence, actually, John Elkington encapsulates the challenge that we face. But it's not everyone, is it? When I say it's us, what I'm suggesting is it's us who are privileged to be speaking to one another via Zoom. But it's not everyone. We're not equally culpable. So if you look by income group now, I'm demonstrating here, or I'm depicting per capita carbon emissions. This is per person per year, tons of CO2 on the vertical axis, and then population on the horizontal axis. So you can see at the moment we're just below 8 billion people on Earth. And so the way to interpret this chart is the area in each rectangle corresponds to the total emissions from that segment of the population. So if you look by income group, so the high income countries or populations are unsurprisingly relatively few, 1.2 billion people, and relatively highly emitting, 11.3 tons per person per year. Upper middle income countries take care of 2.6 billion people with just over half the emissions per capita of the high income countries. And then lower middle income, by the way, these categories I've taken as they're the World Bank, the way the World Bank classifies income groups, countries by income group. The lower middle income, 3 billion people, just over a ton of CO2 per person, just over around about 1.5. And then the low income countries down here, around about a quarter of a ton. Now, what does a ton of CO2 mean? If I can perhaps give you a visual device for a ton of CO2, or how much CO2 do we emit when we go about activities? If I were to fly from Johannesburg to Paris, business class, because, you know, overnight flight, and I want to get into Paris, have a business meeting, and I want to be fresh, so I'll fly business and then I'll fly home the next day. There's 5.5 tons of CO2, one trip in business class between Joburg and Paris, 5.5 tons. So we've got just under 1 billion people on Earth consuming 0.26 tons of CO2 per person per year. Here's South Africa. Now, I'm speaking to you from South Africa, and it might not mean very much to you, but I'm sharing this because I want to make a point just now about inequality. South Africa is 58 million people, classified as an upper middle income country, consuming 8.2 tons per person per year. This is a country with about 27% of these 58 million people living on less than $2 a day. Now, if we look by region, similar chart, but now I'm looking sort of almost continentally. So we've got North America. You can see 17.6 tons per person per year on average. Oceania down here, Europe, less than half on average from versus North America, Latin America and the Caribbean, and then Asia. So here you've got largely China and India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and you know, the large population clusters in Asia, which kind of take care of most of this. And then look at Africa, 1 ton of CO2 per person. And again, I'm going to put South Africa on this chart because continentally, South Africa is part of Africa. But developmentally, certainly in terms of footprint, South Africa is way up there in between Europe and North America in terms of its carbon footprint. Now, remember at the beginning, I showed those curves on the decarbonization, and I showed, well, okay, maybe we could kind of renegotiate with ourselves on climate damage, accepting, of course, that most of the damages accrue in the areas that are least responsible for creating that damage and are also least well equipped to deal with it. But anyway, that aside, let's imagine that we say, well, 1.5 looks too difficult. Let's shoot for the 2 degrees. So the 2 degrees scenario gives us a per capita emissions budget in 2050 of 1.4 tons per person per year. Global average. We're going to be 9.5 billion people roughly, emitting 1.4 tons per person per year. So where is that on this chart? So I hope you can see the yellow dotted lines. 1.4 tons of CO2 per person per year in 30 years, that's our personal carbon budget conceptually. And you can see that every income group country on Earth, except the low income countries, have emissions cuts to make, every one. And if we look by region, you can see even more markedly that it's everywhere except Africa has substantial emissions reductions to make over the next 30 years. And that's on the pathway to absolute zero. So this is really, whether you think of it by income group or by region, this is an agenda that it's extremely inequitable, by the way, because we're talking about most of the countries in Africa, excluding South Africa, really having no bearing on the climate change, you know, the causes of climate change, but being extremely vulnerable to the impacts. But so how is it that South Africa finds itself in the company of Western European and North American countries on this analysis? Well, it's the inequality story, right? So now, again, on the vertical axis here, I'm looking at tons of CO2 per capita per year, same scale as before. And then along the bottom, I'm looking at share of population living in extreme poverty, which is to say less than $2 a day, roughly. And you'll see there's a lot to say about this chart, but I know I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna skip on. But the point here is, it's not that 58 million South Africans are consuming at the level of Germany and Belgium. It's that a couple of million of us are off the charts, and tens of millions of us are down here with next to nothing. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because we tend to be, we tend to see the world through the frame of nation states. I mean, this is how the UNFCCC works, right? It's member states that have sovereign entities that come together and try to solve this problem of a global commons. But within countries, inequality of income and wealth equals inequality of emissions. And South Africa is the most unequal country on earth. And it's an extraordinary outlier because for South Africa's level of emissions, it should have zero poverty. And for South Africa's level of poverty, it should have zero emissions. And the last thing I want to say on this slide is you can see that there are countries down here in the bottom left-hand corner that have comparatively low emissions and comparatively low poverty. So there are, there's a lot of excess consumption going on as you travel north on this graph, a lot of excess consumption, that it's not delivering necessarily better socioeconomic outcomes. And then along the bottom, of course, there's what these countries along the bottom have to do. Let's see if I can get my pen. Let's try that. What these countries along the bottom have to do is go this way. So these countries have to eliminate poverty without carbonizing their economies. These countries have to decarbonize their economies without creating poverty. South Africa's got to do both at the same time. And that is really difficult when you have inequality, because it's really hard to get policy traction if you have very broad constituencies with very different socioeconomic outcomes. So just coming to the end now, another quote, this time from the former governor of the Bank of England, North American. Climate change is the tragedy of the horizon. So we all know about the tragedy of the commons. As Mark Carney puts it, is also the tragedy of the horizon. I think he's hit upon something really important there. The catastrophic impacts of climate change will be felt beyond the traditional horizons of most actors, imposing a cost on future generations that the current generation has no direct incentive to fix. That means beyond the business cycle, the political cycle, and the horizon of technocratic authorities like central banks. In other words, once climate change becomes a defining issue, not only for financial stability, but as in Carney's words, an issue for financial stability, then it may already be too late. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to I'm not sure who's going to facilitate us, whether it's Michael, but I want to just finish with 4 open-ended questions on my initial, my opening slide. So firstly, under paradigms, how can business subordinate self-interest to general interest? For practicalities, how can the energy system practically be decarbonized fully within 30 years? How can social systems reckon with multi-decadal timeframes? And how can the inequities in climate change be peacefully reconciled? Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Gary. And if you can stop sharing your screen, that would be great. There we go. And I welcome the panelists to come back visibly online. I thought that was an extraordinary presentation, Gary. Thank you very, very much. And Gary Fillol, I'd like to ask if you would start with your reflections. You've had a great deal of experience in Africa, as well as having headed the European Foundation Center. And I'm just curious what your reflections are as you listen to Gary's presentation. Can you take yourself off mute, please?
Right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Gary. Thank you, Michael. I'm not going to be very long, but it seems to me that the questions that Gary has asked are fundamental. I spent most of this morning, I'm afraid, hooked watching television, because today was a very important day for those of us that have British passports, because we heard Dominic, I'm blanking on his name now, but Cummings, talk about what happened, what went wrong in the UK response to COVID. And several things came out of his talk today that I thought were directly related to some of the things that Gary was saying. He explained really, and you can see this in the papers tomorrow, I think, that essentially things got completely out of control. and that in the first lockdown, essentially nobody knew what they were doing. They didn't have the systems in place. They didn't have the data in place. They made it up as they went along. Essentially, that's what he said. What he then said was that in the second lockdown, they had learned none of those lessons. So I thought it was really interesting that Gary talked about, here is a crisis you can see happening, and you can see the consequences of it essentially in a relatively short time. And frankly, it doesn't take a nuclear scientist to say lockdown quickly, early, and so on. Instead of which, in the United States, in the UK, in Belgium, in all the places that, even in Norway, where my children and grandchildren live, at times people are saying, well, too much of this. This is awful. We've been consigned to home. We have to get out of this. Let's do away with this, and let's stop. And let's just the reality play itself out. And the truth is that those lessons aren't learned even in that kind of context. I have very deep concern that we need to learn the lessons. We need to find a language for explaining what's going to be happening to us. And I think in some ways COVID is a precursor, but it's also an opportunity for some lessons to learn. And what's fascinating about where we are is that as a species, we seem to be incapable of learning even short-term lessons, never mind ones that we have no precedent for having to have to do. And one of the most important things, I think, is going to be how do we talk to each other without panicking each other and becoming paralyzed by the fact that things are bad. So we have to develop, I think, a language that says the situation is extremely serious. Let us not pull any wool over anybody's eyes, but also let's find the energy and the, can I call it the courage, really, to say we can't take any more nonsense. And it seems to me that one of the most important things is going to be how we communicate to the media, who control both social media and professional media, on how do we get the message across to ordinary people. Because implicit in what Gary said, essentially, is that sacrifice is coming. It can come either because you plan it and you prepare for it and you engage with it, or it's going to come because you're force majeure. And force majeure, frankly, we've just seen, doesn't work very nicely. And it certainly doesn't deal with the weak and the vulnerable if we have any interest in what's going on in their lives. And so I think this is actually a very important day to hold this talk. And I'll stop talking now. I'm happy to come back later. But I'm just saying I really found his portrayal of what we're about to face powerful, especially in the context of the conversation today. I'll stop there.
Gary, thank you so much. And Tamsin, you just posted a wonderful comment. Could you bring it into the conversation?
Sorry, Michael, actually that was posted by Robert in the Q&A that I was just putting into the chat. But, for my own comment, I suppose, Gary, building on what Jerry has said, I remember you talking about how we needed a moonshot. And I've been thinking about that for a while and wondering why it wouldn't happen. And last week we had a conversation about influences and about influence capture. And there were 4 kind of real challenges to effective action. The first was competition neglect, confirmation bias, overconfidence, and a foolish consistency, right? All of which I think would come into that. But my thought on the moonshot, and I'd be interested now, because this was 10 years ago, I should just say with you, is a moonshot even possible when climate change is not seen as an ego win the same way as reaching the moon was? And is that part of this problem?
Thank you
Yeah.
very much. Mark Valentine, you have been working with us on at Omega, done one important paper for us, or working on another. You've worked in a lot of these areas. What reflections come up for you from Gary's presentation?
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Gary. Compelling presentation and a stark reminder of the challenge that we face. Yeah, yeah, it's one of those things where you're forced to ask yourself, is the past prologue? You know, we are going to have to do things that we've never done. The question is, what do we need to do to enable that possibility? It's clear that our economic system reinforces all the things that are wrong in terms of carbon consumption and a disparity in affluence. It makes me think about clearly a subject that, Gary, you've thought a lot about, stakeholder capitalism, and can we make that shift from our current extractive model to a stakeholder capitalism model that, you know, diffuses wealth and also perhaps defuses the carbon crisis. And I'm also, I've been reminded lately, talking to younger people, about generational divide and the energy, so to speak, of millennials and Gen Z to tackle some of these issues. And, you know, in there is a certain amount of, I don't know, youthful, and I mean this in a positive way, hubris. They just are going to take this on. I was just reviewing the shockingly sophisticated website of a college-age daughter of a friend of mine who's, I was going to say militant, wrong term, very passionate vegan, and is trying to get tweens and teens engaged in vegan dietary issues as part of the climate solution. And I don't mean to put that forward as the example of how we're going to get through this possibly evolutionary bottleneck, which is really what we're facing. But I am curious, you know, from Gary's perspective on these issues of sort of, you know, maybe the fuel for Tamsin's moonshot lies in the generations right behind us. And the question is, how do we hold the door open long enough to let them get their shot? And yeah, where do you see promising trends in stakeholder capitalism? And then the other systemic dysfunction we have is, you know, currently the I don't know, appalling state of decay of many of the so-called liberal democracies. We've got 19th century models of governance contending with 21st century problems, and very few of them obviously are up to the challenge. Speaking of something that in America we tend to just take as background noise and pain, we spend way too little time trying to actually modernize our governance system, and we instead focus on shoving it and bullying it and beating it, but we actually don't fix it in any kind of meaningful way because they're so desperate to get it to give us things in the moment without thinking about its durability in the long term. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about, and those are questions I would love to hear Gary's thoughts and other panelists as well.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm going to ask Gary to hold off because I really want to harvest as much from our panelists as we can. Linnea Lombard, in Washington State, you've been very engaged in these issues. What are your reflections on Gary's presentation?
Well, first, thank you, Gary. I particularly like your first slide of the 4 quadrants. My work as a co-creator of New Stories really is trying to work on the paradigm shift. How do you shift the whole belief system that you showed with Friedman and earlier of, you know, greed is good, self-interest is good, which is only one part of an evolutionary model that just basically requires cooperation and collaboration, which is where I'm working mostly of how to shift that core paradigm. And I see it happening. I'm part of the movement for socially responsible investing and philanthropy and business leaders who are already trying to add more and more of the social context in. That isn't to say that I'm optimistic. I struggle a lot with, when I see things in the news, like particularly the big lie in America. It's just baffling to me that huge parts of our population are willing to live in fantasy and don't want reality. And it's it's an ongoing struggle for me that I don't have a real answer to. But I keep trying to kind of keep on keeping on, trying to shift the paradigm in every way that I can think of.
Thank you, Linnea. And I want to call on Asher Miller, who's the executive director, I believe, of the Post-Carbon Institute and runs the resilience.org website, and has really been a leader in this country and internationally on the polycrisis with Richard Heinberg, his thought partner, and also has worked extensively with the VKRF Foundation, which has pioneered in creating the first climate-focused program that takes the polycrisis into direct account. And what this gives me an opportunity to say just before Asher starts out is that Gary's presentation was really about climate, and it really wasn't. It wasn't about the polycrisis. And I think what the polycrisis introduces is the probability of a much more difficult situation of doing this by design, and a much higher likelihood of doing it by disaster. And I would almost be willing to argue that the fact that it will likely be done by disaster actually increases the probability that we will meet the climate goals, because the disaster is likely to drive it down potentially very dramatically. So I just wanted to, the final point I want to make is that you said that the consensus view is that that COVID came out of somebody eating a bat, and the emerging consensus, the former head of the FDA, for example, is that it probably came out of that Wuhan laboratory, and therefore it probably came out of an enhancement of function research on the virus. And therefore it is, the enemy is us again, in a very, very profound way. And perhaps the reason why it is so active in mutation is because it had that enhancement of function research going on. So in any case, Asher, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure, thanks, Michael. I'll try to be brief. And Gary, I really appreciated your presentation. I took a bunch of screenshots, I hope you don't mind, because there are some slides in there that I thought were really useful.
Any of you can have the slides afterwards, there's no problem.
That would be great. Want to share it with some of my teammates here. I guess just a few thoughts and reaction, which is not to offer any, unfortunately, solace or solutions, but I think just further exploration of the challenge that we have. One, I was just thinking about, like in the slide that you showed, just looking at the RCPs, right? 8.5 and 2.6, and I don't want to get geeky about the math there, but just to underscore the fact that even in these climate models, there's this assumption of growth that's built in. So 8.5 assumes there are no limits, basically, in terms of our capacity to consume fossil fuels, which I think we could dispute. And that's not to say that we should relax, because 8.5 won't happen. But even 2.6, which is the lowest scenario, has these assumptions built in that I think are highly questionable. In fact, it assumes greater energy demand over time than the other models, but it assumes a huge amount of nuclear power and carbon capture sequestration, all of these, beliefs, and it's kind of unquestioned by the climate scientists who are turning to economists, for these scenarios to look at what the climate impacts are. And that just shows that, this challenge of us depending up, exist in our silos, we depend on others in their silos for knowledge and information, and there's often no real questioning of the fundamental assumptions that are built into those. Another is just, again, thinking about paradigms, which to me is in some ways the most hopeful and the most intractable area of challenge for us, because it's kind of hard to get your hand on them. It's like holding water. And it happens to be the water that we all swim in and don't really even recognize that we're swimming in. And this paradigm, another paradigm I think that we have to deal with, is this embedded belief system in a certain kind of progress, which makes it very challenging for us. And I would say on the climate front, on the economic front, social justice front, all of that, I think there's this dependency we have on this vision of the future. For those of us who feel like we have any agency at all, that has to be consistent with this idea of continual progress in a certain way. And that idea of progress, I think, is actually a relatively recent phenomenon too. That also, I think, comes from the fossil fuel age and the technological age. But it's just one I think that we have to recognize and grapple with, even those of us who are trying to get humanity on this right path. What are we trying to work towards, and how does that lock us in? Another thing that I was thinking about, I'm a huge fan of Dana Meadows' work in systems thinking, and I think it's one of the gaps that we have in our education. A huge gap that we have is we don't teach systems thinking enough. But I also think there's a challenge we have when we try to understand and think about complex systems interacting with one another, and then having this idea that if we could just figure out the system and then figure out what is the leverage point, and if we could just find the right one, we could sort of like change the course of things. And I suffer from that myself, like constantly trying to think about, well, you know, what lever do we need to be pushing on? Because the path that we're on is horrific. But I also think that we have to give up some sense of control when we think about how all these systems are playing out. And then that gets to my last thing, which is just the challenge of psychology, and the challenge of, in my work, I find that I'm constantly dealing with people that are in sort of these different camps. One camp is this just inherent belief that in human innovation, and that we'll figure this out somehow, right? And if we just have the right policy, the right leadership, the right technology, we'll get, you know, we'll get this sorted. And it tends to be the people that have studied this stuff for the longest, or understand ecology or certain things, who tend to fall into a certain fatalism, you know. And the struggle of staying in the space between those things, I think, is very difficult for us. And it's a psychological struggle. I think a lot of times people fall into these camps because it releases them of that tension that we have to live in, which is letting go of the expectation that we're going to solve this, and at the same time feeling like we have agency to somehow change the trajectory that we're on right now. I'll stop there.
Sure, thank you very much. Because our time is winding down, I want to give Gary a little opportunity to respond. I'm going to try to ask those who comment further to be brief. Joan Diamond, any thoughts and reflections from your role at the Millennial Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere? You're on mute, and also the FAN Initiative.
Well, first, I want to thank you, Gary. That was really inspirational. So I'll be real quick just to list. I would like to sort of hear more, gain more insight into the issue of leadership, and whether there are examples of leaders who really have approached things from a systems perspective and not been fired. I'll use that as shorthand, or fallen off. Another point that came up more in the discussion was the issue of sacrifice and the language that we use, given that most measures of well-being have us living very differently than we live today. So is it really sacrifice, or is it some sort of change? Tamsin, I think that you posed an interesting issue on the differentiation in the moonshot, and is there an aspirational goal? I mean, maybe survival, and survival for the future is aspirational, but it doesn't have the same motivation as something that is sort of visionary. And finally, just a commentary that, a comment that I prefer the word responding to solving, that if we can make peace with the fact that we aren't going to solve this, but there are constructive responses, I think that brings more people into the conversation. But
Thank you.
most want to hear about leadership.
Wonderful. And I'm going to call on Lynn Murphy and then Carlos Schultz, again, brief. But before they do, Howard Frumpkin just posed a beautiful comment, been very active in philanthropy and public health. What is the role of organized religion in changing the paradigm and driving change? Some intriguing features, longest existing human institutions, moral foundations that offer a counterpoint to greed, very large scale globally. I'd appreciate Gary and panelists' thought. So with that, I'll go to Lynn for a brief comment and then Carlos, and I hope to reach Miguel Alcieri as well. Lynn, brief comment.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Gary, for that and for all the comments that were made. What I'm really reflecting on a lot is, I think what Asher also invoked, which is we're swimming in the waters of, if I go back to paradigms of neoliberalism, that inherently want to bring us to self-interest and competition models and want to have the seduction of we in the global north as individuals need to solve this, and or the failed paradigm of the nation state. And you were invoking this idea of stakeholder capitalism. And so I've been thinking about what is, this comes from some of the work through racial equity and that work. What is equity consciousness and those deeper paradigms? And what's the role of memetics really to get to these, that I would even dare I say embodied cognition that can start to reveal where some of our blind spots are and the seductions of where we might go in terms of policy or looking at this stakeholder, but still leaving ourselves out of it, but also not putting the onus only on the individuals. So that's one of the reflections that I'm having. And the other is just quite bluntly, where is the role of philanthropy? Are we a blockage in terms of continued investments in equity markets and trying to do kind of incremental change with trying to raise normative questions with corporations or individuals or look at policy change and do the problem solutions? But really what is some of the steps of where philanthropy has to get honest and reckon with itself in this moment? And I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. And Asher just wrote a note saying to Lynn's comments about memetics, I highly recommend checking out the work of Culture Hack. So Carlos, brief thoughts from Lynn, I think is in Costa Rica. Carlos is in Brazil. Carlos, brief thoughts. You're on mute, Carlos.
Thank you, Michael. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you, Gary, Michael, Stanley, for helping to organize this, and all the panelists. I find myself somewhere in between the old school and the new school, and via today's webinar, wanting to share a lot of things that bring me optimism, but also wanting to share a bunch of questions in which to fill in the gaps. So for the most part, I see two paths forward. One dealing with communications, one dealing with administration. Communication is, in a sense, recognizing that, yes, in regards to administration, a small group of people could change things. People who had to create new paradigms or people who understand systems enough to put a certain dynamic into order and then effectively put that into scale. So that is what I think this group, in a sense, is about. And on the other sense, communications, I rarely see any ambition or bold visions or understanding that we literally need a global ad council, meaning very effective ads to ultimately influence the masses in becoming better consumers, smarter voters. That's a great conversation that needs to be had. Unfortunately, I don't really see it much out there, but it's very possible. They did it. They've done it before for the worst of reasons, be it the drugs on war or the war on drugs and many countless things. But on the administrative area, I am optimistic that yes, the up and coming entrepreneurs will develop new paradigms, and economics might become the most exciting science of the next decade. And I see smart software putting a lot of things in order, helping lives be more orderly, organizations be more orderly, and eventually ultimately government be more orderly. And lastly, I'll suggest that, beyond smart software, if we ever achieve artificial intelligence, maybe artificial intelligence won't immediately attack humans as it's so often portrayed in movies, but artificial intelligence may ultimately help shepherd humans. Yet I seldom see smart conversations with very influential and capable organizations and people discussing this. Artificial intelligence, as of yet, is pointing its capacity towards the stars or atoms and not effectively recognizing its power to help us solve these almost unsolvable problems. A case in point, up until now, algorithms have been made to invade our privacy and affect campaigns and elections. These same algorithms will soon be flipped and will be helping humans make sure that their governments are doing the right things and corporations are doing the right things. So my question is, it's possible for anyone that's curious enough to follow the money and understand what happened in the 60s and 70s, especially between neocons and libertarians, and a small handful of very rich foundations funding countless think tanks and hundreds of other foundations. Where are the good guys doing this? I still, even though I want to understand who are the main game changers, where are the think tanks that are funding the small group of people to go further into this? And I seldom, I barely recognize these think tanks beyond Omega and a few other.
Carlos, I ask you to summarize.
Yeah, so my question to Gary and anyone in the panel is, are there already an existing network of think tanks that are well funded, that are well coordinated to do maybe something that the neocons and libertarians were very effective in doing, and putting this in this horrible path of, where we now face global destruction? Are the good guys, are the solutions being as well organized, as well financed as the bad guys?
Thank you. And we had a great quote from Barry Knight saying, nice to have a positive, optimistic voice on the panel. And Carlos, we can count on you for that. So thank you very much. Miguel Altieri, I don't know if you can come on screen. There you are. And your comments, Miguel, would be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Nice seeing you and everybody there. I'm based in Colombia, South America, and I think that the talk was really about the ecological debt that the North has with the South, because I see here in Latin America countries like Honduras or Haiti or Nicaragua, even if they went carbon neutral, that would make no difference. And and if the countries that have very low contributions, like you mentioned, they are in Africa or in Latin America or in Asia, many corporations are trying to buy their carbon credits for being low emitters in order for them to continue polluting. So as you said, we need to turn the corporations upside down, because in the realm of agriculture, I think that there are the biggest opportunities to advance into a carbon neutral scenario. For example, in the world, 70% of the food that we eat is produced by small farmers that only control 30% of the land, but they produce with 20% of the fossil fuels compared to industrial agriculture. But these farmers are being undermined because of the appetite from the North. For example, in South America, we're having huge deforestation for what? To produce soybean and to produce cattle, to feed China, to feed the United States, to feed Europe. Whereas we have the solutions. These farmers that I work with here in Antioquia are carbon neutral. They don't use inputs. They have ecologically diversified farming systems that promote ecological services that go beyond just the services to have a healthy agriculture, but that society at large benefits. But why cannot we scale up that agriculture, peasant agriculture, small farm agriculture throughout the world? We need land reform. We need many, many measures that are not going to be very popular. So I see that this gap that you talked about, I think that the farmers that I work with are very comfortable with 1.4 tons, but I don't see the North coming down from 12 to 1.4. How are they going to do it? It's sacrificing, you know, the benefits that capitalism brings and the consumption patterns that they have had for centuries. And here within Colombia and Chile or many other countries, we also have groups that live like in the North. So I don't see how this is going to be turned around other than just continue promoting action on the ground. And maybe these small lighthouses we're creating are going to be creating an energy and a collective action that is going to change things at the regional level. Thank you very much.
Miguel, thank you so much. And also just you taught this field at UC Berkeley for decades and are a global leader in thinking about sustainable agriculture. Of course, Prince Charles just recently made the same point that small scale farmers are going to have to be the future. Before I turn back to Gary for just 5-minute summary, speaking of Carlos's wonderful optimism, Mark said Peter Layden, the former editor of Wired, is bullish on the future due to emerging technologies. He's firmly in the techno-optimist camp. peterleiden.medium.com. So Gary, you've stimulated a wonderful conversation. You can't begin to answer all these questions in 5 minutes, but just some broad reflections on what you've heard and what you'd like us to take home from this conversation.
Wow. I mean, to be honest with you, I had the experience listening to all of the panelists that I haven't had at any point in my career, honestly, that this is an extraordinary group that you've got assembled here of people who really are applying themselves to think about these problems in ways that I don't come across. So it's strange because I actually found myself having this like really unusual cocktail of emotions. That, you know, we're talking about some pretty grim realities, and yet I hadn't felt more hopeful than this for a long time, because I don't, as I say, I don't come across people that that often that think like this group. So that was brilliant. I really enjoyed it, and I'm not going to be able to do justice to all of the inputs. I want to just say a couple of things though, and I noticed Jerry's got his hand up, so at some point I've got to leave some time for Jerry as well. But on the techno optimism, I had this experience in the Kruger Park recently. This thought occurred to me that I was on a biomimicry course, right? And it's, you know, let's see what we can learn from nature, right? And it's brilliant. It's an unbelievable laboratory to think about, you know, systems and feedback loops and complexity and processes and design and life's principles and all that good stuff. And then I thought, are any of these species showing restraint? Any of them, right? Or are they actually submitting to balancing feedback loops? In other words, every species that I was thinking about was trying to maximize. Now the system as a whole perhaps optimizes through these balancing feedback loops, you know, if the predator-prey cycles and all that kind of stuff. But I thought, if I could give the lions a Gatling gun and opposable thumbs, would they just wipe out the impala? Yes, they probably would. Right? So when we say biomimicry, we're already, but you know, we are biology, right? We are part of the biosphere, and we're just another species, and we're also maximizing. And I thought, well, okay, but the difference is we've certainly got the knowledge, if not the wisdom, to exercise restraint, right? And that is, if anything marks us out as a species, it should be that capacity to exercise restraint. And so the way I see the current paradigm, oh, sorry, the point about techno-optimism is the thought struck me that what is technology actually? It's a solution to balancing feedback loops. It's something we apply to put a delay into a balancing feedback loop, right? I don't know if this is true. I haven't. This is perhaps half-baked, but it's just a nascent thought. That maybe by just throwing more and more and more technology at our problems, we're just trying to delay the feedback loops that are going to get us. There is no two ways about it. Those balancing feedback loops are going to get us. It's just a question of when. So that's what I think about technology. You know, there's that great book, I don't know if any of you know, Too Smart for Our Own Good by Craig Dilworth. You know, we just engineer our way out of a corner and the solution sets up the next corner that we engineer our way into, and then we have to come out again.
We need to wrap up here. Any last?
Oh, I'm ever so sorry. Look, there's just so many things to talk about, and we just don't have time. I want to thank everybody. I want to just say one last thing where what I think the current paradigm, how I characterize it, and then where we've got to go to. Current paradigm, it seems to me, which is, you know, perhaps rooted in Western colonialism or whatever, it's extractive, exploitative, exclusive, right? And it has to move, however this looks, the new paradigm, it's got to be regenerative, reciprocal, and representative. So that for me is the paradigm shift. I don't know how. And the last thing is we are trying to do this at the moment that we're being pulled in opposite directions by social media. The moment that we've got to come together and notice that we have more in common than we have differentiating us, we are being asked to focus on what differentiates us. And that's terrifying for me. So thank you very much for hosting me, Michael. I just hope that we have an opportunity to do this once more. Because
we look
just
forward to that. And I'm going, in closing, we're going to go just a couple of minutes over briefly to Jerry, and then I'm going to give Tamsin the last words since she brought us all together. Jerry, your final reflection.
Okay, thank you. I'll try and be very fast. I'm an anthropologist, and so my job, in essence, is to look at things from the outside, and that's what I've been doing all my life. And one of the things that I find fascinating about this group is indeed that we need to look at things from the outside. One of the problems, I think, in the discourse that we've just had is this business about saying it's either this or that there is an answer over here, and if you just get it right over here, it's okay. So you can be optimistic instead of being pessimistic, or, you know, you can put all your hope on technology. We're going to need all of it, because in fact, this is too complicated a set of problems. But if I can just finish with this thought, some of the work that anthropologists have done have been about how mankind, how humanity deals and grapples with problems. And there is a huge difference between the engineer who needs a blueprint and cannot function without a blueprint, and the bricoleur who essentially has to confront new problems every day with a finite set of tools. And actually, all the discourse, I mean, Miguel was saying this more or less, we have examples of where people can stay in touch with their own nature, and we aren't using them enough. So this is a moment of redress too, to recognize that there are people who are actually living lives in different ways. And, you know, you're talking from South Africa, Gary. Ubuntu is a very real issue. And I think we can bring back reciprocity. I think actually reciprocity makes the world go round. It does already, actually. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And Linnea Lombard just asked Gary if he can put the last thing you said about, there we go. Oh, it was Tamsin's doing it. Thank you. So Tamsin, your last thoughts. You brought us together. We're most grateful for this growing, strong collaboration with you and your colleagues. We owe a lot to you all for bringing your energy and strength into our community. Last reflections. You're on mute, Thames.
Sorry. I would just like to thank everybody, but most especially Gary, who 10 years ago completely changed my life. And I'm delighted that I'm still getting him to speak to as many people as I can put him in front of. And Michael, very glad that you hosted this group. So hopefully it'll be the start of even further conversations with all of us. You know, we have a normal another group on Thursday nights, and this with Omega. But it would be great to. I think this is the start of a conversation, not the end of one. Gary, thank you all.
And thank you all. One of the things I just noticed, a very simple fact, is that when you're on gallery view, you can see everybody if you have 12 people. And so in terms of community work, I'm going to remember that and ask Stanley to remember it, that we can all be present on one screen when there are 12 of us as panelists, and then others, wonderful, wonderful colleagues who joined us, Howard Frumpkin, David Bombright, and others who joined us in the chat function. But really, thanks to all the panelists and thanks to all who participated. Gary, this was a beautiful presentation, and we look forward to building the collaboration with you and Tamsin and Jerry and our other colleagues as we move forward. So we'll be in touch. We will let you know, Stanley will let you all know when the recording is up, and you can post it wherever you like. And he will also capture the chat function so that we can access that if we need to. So enjoy your day or your night. And Gary, thanks again to all.
Thanks very much.
All right. Bye.
Thanks, Gary.
Cheers.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Dan.